Welcome to this cycle, what's going on in the world, the normalization of the far right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We organized this cycle with the support of the program of the European Commission Citizens, Equality, Rights and Values. And we have chosen this topic because for a few years now, the far right has gained positions in the EU, also in the rest of the world. And actually, I started working here about 12 years ago, approximately, and I remember that the first European election that I experienced as a researcher of CIDOB in 2014, we were already talking about the rise of the far right, but it is true that, for example, if we take as a reference the last two elections in the European Parliament, 2019 and 2024, we do see there has been a substantial increase. We've gone from less than 20% of MPs to almost 25% of seats in the European Parliament. From two groups to three, the far right is split, but it is also true that there are increasingly more far-right parties ruling European countries. We now have them present in Italy, Hungary, Croatia, Finland, and Slovakia. And probably after the elections of last weekend in the Czech Republic, it will happen there also. There are far-right parties that support their government, such as the case of Sweden. And there are even some far-right parties, such as in the case of Poland, where the president actively blocks the functioning of its government. Also, out of the 5 big countries of the EU, 4 of them, Germany, France, Italy, and Poland, the far-right countries lead the surveys. And is everything all right? Okay. So I was saying that in 4 out of the 5 large countries of the EU, the far-right countries lead the surveys. If we look at the UK, which is, if it were in the EU, it would be one of the largest countries as well. They also lead the polls there. And there are some countries such as Portugal or Romania where the far-right parties have replaced the center-right or center-left traditional parties as the main party in the opposition. And if we add to this the fact that in the United States we have a far-right president, we have the far-right all over the world boosted because their agenda has been strengthened. Despite this, if we look at the figures, we could say that the far-right is not so influential. In the end, it is 20% of the EU countries that are ruled by the far right, or the influence of the far right reaches the government in those countries. But we have to ask ourselves whether this red alert is justified. Maybe we should also wonder whether the far right needs to be in the government to be influential. So in order to answer these questions and many more, I have here with me this afternoon Camil Ungureanu, more or less, Serra Húnter, Associate Professor of Political Theory at Pompeu Fabra University, Carme Colomina, Senior Researcher here at CIDOB, and Zsuzsanna Vegh, Program Officer at the German Marshall Fund of the Berlin office. Thank you very much for being here. Camille, we'll start with you. And I wanted to ask you about the influence of these far-right parties in the national party systems. The case of Romania, which was quite relevant back in the day, the case of Moldova that you know quite well, and the difficult question, what is the influence of having far-right parties in European countries in times of elections? Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'll speak in English.
3 questions, basically. I try to answer very briefly by starting to say that as a very quick reaction to what you're saying, are we supposed to be concerned? Yes, I think we are supposed to be concerned because it's pretty much everywhere, with small exceptions. The extreme right is going up. The most powerful democracy, as you just mentioned, in the world, United States, and the most populous ones, they are led, India and United States, they are led by parties and by leaders who can be qualified as extreme right. So it's a global phenomenon. It's not only European; it's a global phenomenon, and we don't have, with small exceptions, the answers to the challenge of the extreme right has been very, very poor, right? Maybe I'll come back to that because this is important. You know, what to do about it and what has been done about this, right? So, and one of the answers, as you mentioned, is what is called militant democracy. So, for instance, some parties or some people, they are prohibited from taking part in elections. The recent case in Moldavia, but also in Romania, this has happened. I'll come back to that. But what I wanted to point out in relation to your first question, of course, is a big question. The impact of the extreme right on the party system. I want to make on the national party systems, right? Then we'll move to Europe and so on. But I want to make two remarks with respect to this question. The first one is that there is a change, pretty obvious, with respect to the center-right parties, right? There is a crisis of the center, which I think is pretty general. We are going through this also here in Spain, in Catalonia, I would argue, as well, but it's very general, right? So it's very obvious in the United States, the center-right party has converted to extreme right party. There is a radical transformation, but also in India, the party that supports Modi more or less was a center-right party, now is an extreme right party, right? These cases can be multiplied, you know, so there are different reactions and different ways of dealing from the perspective of the center-right with the extreme right, but in general, we have cases of radical transformation of the center-right parties, like United States and in India, partial transformation, right? For instance, I would argue, but maybe this is polemic, that the PP basically is a split party between a center-right and a radical right party. Ayuso, from what I can tell, with respect to many issues, represents sort of extreme right positions. Think, for instance, of a climate change, denialism, and so on and so forth. And other parties that collaborate, center-right parties that collaborate occasionally. They move more to the extreme right, they collaborate occasionally, sometimes they collaborate, sometimes they try to resist, and so on and so forth. So there is a deep crisis at the center, right? I think that is very general. It has occurred to different degrees. This is growing and is very, very worrying. We see that in Catalonia here, with concerning the relationship between Junts and Aliança Catalana is a dynamic relationship. We'll see what happens, but it's pretty clear that Junts has got closer to the Aliança Catalana. That's the first observation. The second observation, obviously, there are new parties, right? So the party competition at the national level has changed. Here in Spain, obviously, has changed. Right? And the party competition is really important. And this change in the nature of the party competition by the emergence of new parties has pushed in general the debates in the public sphere and the policies more to the extreme right. Obviously, I have a little time, so maybe get to speak about particular cases. There are differences between, cases in which extreme right is in power, from like in Italy and in other places, or cases like Romania, when the extreme right has converted into the main opposition party. Now, with respect to the second part of the question, we take a step towards the periphery of the European Union. With respect to these two countries that have had in recent time, elections, Romania and Moldavia, right? And what happened in Romania and Moldavia, I'm originally Romanian. What happened in Romania, to the dismay of many Western commentators, and what happened very recently in Moldavia, again to the dismay of many Western commentators, parties and candidates were banned from participating into the electoral process. This is what happened in 2024 in Romania, and then it was reiterated with respect to the presidential elections in 2025. So the Constitutional Court basically reiterated the decision of banning certain, not all, certain candidates, Călin Georgescu, chameleon-like, very talented, particular type of populist. Most probably Călin Georgescu would have been the Romanian president had it been banned by the Constitutional Court. Now, in Moldavia it was a little bit different because while in Romania parties were not banned, Călin Georgescu was an independent, also a leader of another party, a woman far-right politician called Șoșoacă, who is now in the parliament, in the European Parliament, sorry, was banned actually before Georgescu was banned. What happened in Moldavia was that they banned parties, right? So this poses interesting questions, right? So was that legitimate, right? Should we follow the examples of Romania and Moldavia? The concept that is used in political theory and political science and law with respect to this phenomenon is what is called militant democracy, which refers to the use by the state of legal means, sometimes political as well, but mainly legal means, in order to ban certain extreme right candidates. Very briefly about that, because I think this is very controversial. I'm a supporter of a militant democracy. I think that militant democracy mechanisms in certain circumstances can be and should be used, right? Now, in Romania, in particular, it was a total mess. Why it was a mess? It was a mess because in Romania, the Constitutional Court provided very poor arguments in order to ban these two leaders, the woman Șoșoacă, Călin Georgescu, and had a very poor communication strategy. That was the second point. And the third point was that it stopped the elections for the president after they began. So people basically in the diaspora, some of them already voted, and actually it was during the process that the Constitutional Court intervened, right? Let me give you a concrete example of a messy argument provided by the court to ban Șoșoacă, but the arguments were very, very poor, right? Just like very concrete examples. The Romanian Constitution stipulates the mechanism whereby Romania is supposed to procedurally join NATO and European Union. It did that some years ago, right? But this was stipulated some 20 years ago in the Romanian Constitution. The procedures to join NATO and European Union, right? Now, Șoșoacă, these extreme right leaders, argued at certain points, we should just leave European Union. Europe is in decline, and so on and so forth. We should leave it. We should follow our own way. So what the Constitutional Court argued, and I think that this is for a first-year student in law or in political science, is really a sophism, argued that Șoșoacă, by saying that, was against the Constitution. But the Constitution doesn't say European Union should be part of the European, Romania should be part of NATO, of European Union. It doesn't say that. Just mentions the procedures whereby Romania can join this organization. So it was really a forced argument. 2 minutes. Okay. So in Romania it was a total mess, right? However, let's say in abstract, I think that the position, in particular with respect to Călin Georgescu, the position that says he should have been banned, is defensible, right? Why is it that? Well, from my perspective, for the reason that Călin Georgescu, by comparison with other extreme right leaders in Romania, had clear contacts with paramilitary organizations. So I think in certain cases, not in all cases of extreme right, there is extreme right and extreme right. That's very important to make distinctions here. In certain cases, it's important to ban. And the same in Moldavia. The Moldavians did it in a much better way. They banned 2 parties. Now, it might seem scandalous. They were pro-Russian parties. But the point of the Constitutional Court was not simply to say, well, they're pro-Russians, therefore we ban them. No, 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 no. The Constitutional Court invoked very simply the electoral law. And the electoral law states that those parties that are financed, whose campaign is financed by foreign sources, Russian, Chinese, Jupiterian, or whatever, are to be excluded from the electoral competition, right? That's the law, you know. So it didn't ban them because they're pro-Russian. It banned them because they rely of external. That was the law. So in Moldavia, it was done much better. Maybe it's also controversial. You should speak about the legitimacy of this type of law and maybe perverse consequences. But I think that in Moldavia, they did it more systematically, based on arguments, based on a very good communication strategy, while in Romania that was missing. However, I think is defensible, in particular with respect to what could have been our president, the eccentric, extremely talented, charismatic, populist Călin Georgescu. I think there are very good, solid, normative reasons for the state to intervene. Again, it's about extreme situations, but I think that democracies should use law to defend itself in these extreme cases. I stop here, but then we have occasion for sure to speak about it.
Thank you, Camil. Carme, si et sembla, passem a tu.
Carme, we can continue with you. I wanted to ask you, how do we transfer what Camil said to the European level? And what is the impact of far-right parties in European integration and in the future of the EU? All right. Thank you very much. The European snapshot is probably something you know, because we pay attention to the far-right forces every time they come. And more, I see that Europe is getting into some sort of acceptance of the lesser evil. Because if there's something that we're seeing in European elections is this slow-mo but inexorable increase of far-right forces. You gave us a snapshot at the beginning, this 26% of seats in the hands of the 3 families of the far-right in parliament. But the most important thing, I believe, after this last election, European election, is 2 things. First is the fact that now this far-right has become very strong in the founding countries at the heart of the EU. Because the far-right did clearly well in the European elections in Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and they clearly won in Austria and Slovenia. We should also know very clearly that the dangerous terrain of the far right in Europe is not the European Parliament, it is the Council and the Council of Ministers. This is precisely where, in a Europe which is clearly intergovernmental, that is where the normalization process has taken a stronghold in the EU, in the European Council, with the first coalition of government in Austria in the year 1999-2000, and we should only look at what has happened now. So the clear responsibility is in the member states, and you made a list of different governments that are in the hands of the far right. And I think it is very important to know clearly now that 1/3 of all governments of member states are made up by coalitions with the far right included. 1/3 of member states that set the political guidelines of the EU. And in those where this doesn't happen, I will clearly talk about the case of France and Germany. The far right is the big electoral hope for a great deal of the population. Marine Le Pen was almost there at the gates. She can reinforce after this European election. First force in terms of seat is Marine Le Pen's national group. And it's the first force in the French National Assembly. We're seeing the upturn crisis of the government because they are in the hands of what this party wants. And to say this clear, I think if there is something that can explain this process of the far right in Europe is the Le Pen movement and their results. In just a few years, Le Pen's party came into the assembly. In 2012, then in 2024, 143 seats in just 12 years. And this electoral success of Marine Le Pen, this transformation, not in physical terms of or brand, but also the political agenda, this capacity to identify grievances, this capacity to reconvert, to make herself into the representative of the working class in France who have felt affected by all of the processes of globalization, explains one of the clearest processes that is affecting the far right. And the other one is Alternative for Germany, this big current that we are seeing. When Camil talked about the US, for example, I think the result of Alternative for Germany is the translation of the zero cost at the moment for these political parties of being persecuted, of being in a court process, or having a narrative that is completely disconnected from reality or the figures. It's not just Donald Trump. I think the electoral successes of Alternative for Germany, a party with leaders who are declared fascist and who have been prosecuted, it doesn't have a cost for them in the ballot. So it's a process of normalization of the far right that clearly governs 1/3 of European countries, and that for the first time after this European election is also within the European Commission in the executive power of the EU. And what else is happening in this process of normalization of the far right? The more representation, the more diversification. The far right is more present, but more heterogeneous now. And it's very diverse, also in terms of their ideals and ideas. Everything can fit in there: economic protectionism, free market fundamentalism, elitism, populism, LGBTI inclusion and homophobia, attacks against the climate dictatorship and eco-fascism, and these together with white supremacy that says that only whites have a right to resources. So all of these contradictions are at the same time part of a cross-sectionality that we see in the polls and in the governments. And as I said, there are cross-sectional matters: rejecting immigration, gender ideology, as they call it, a concern for cultural identity and sovereignty. And I think they also have in common the capacity to use digital media. I think this explosion of the far right from the US to Europe, but also going through Latin America, couldn't be explained without the eruption of social media. And we should know clearly that behind this, there are capabilities and a method. They have a method. There's heterogeneity in their agenda, but at the same time, we're seeing it is a movement that has a structure. They have an ideology, they have data analysis, They have communication strategies, shared communication strategies, and they have managed to create a transnational network of the far right that uses these bonds, these links, and they are opportunistic oftentimes, because what they do is to use whatever works for them, and they undermine wherever goes against what they defend. But all of this is changing the rules of the game in the EU in a very clear manner. And finally, answering the second part of the question, you asked about the impact of all of this in integration. And one of the things that has been strengthened in this new political cycle is the paradox that the more power the European Commission has, more Euroscepticism there is. And I think if for a very long time we've been explaining the process of European integration based on two great pillars, we had the two great pillars that explained European construction, which were integration and broadening. And I think we should add a third pillar, which is legitimacy. We cannot explain the process of European integration only based on integration and broadening without taking into account the cost of this in the relationship between institutions and the citizenship. Because what legitimacy tells us is that in order to exercise this authority has to be accepted and believable by those who are ruled by it. So also because of the multiple crises the EU has gone through recently, the more power the EU institutions have had, more Euroscepticism has grown. So this permissive consensus that we've talked about again and again has become a restrictive dissent, seen clearly in votes. And this affects not only policies, but also the concepts that were fundamental to European construction. I think in this process of acceptance of far-right politics, internal solidarity mechanisms have been impacted, and political polarization has increased. So we are experiencing an EU which is stronger in terms of competencies, but it acts under the intergovernmental domain of European democracies that are becoming weaker and weaker. And this is a contradiction. Just 30 more seconds. So for me, this is the main contradiction. We have strengthened EU institutions, but at the cost of colliding with weaker democracies, and European democracy is as weak as the democracies of the member states. And this finally connects with this situation of poly-crisis or perma-crisis, because if all of this process to strengthen competencies is oftentimes the answer to the feeling of vulnerability or the fears that have assailed the EU lately, well, the more fear, the more far-right votes. And what has strengthened the EU oftentimes has strengthened the far right and extreme right parties, or radical right parties. Thank you very much. Carme?
I want to ask you about the extreme right party's foreign policy, because for a while we've been saying that what hinders this cooperation of these far-right parties is their vision towards foreign policy, because they have different visions on Russia, different visions on Trump, etc., etc. So if you could touch upon this. And then, of course, I would like to ask you about Hungary. It is the reference point of extreme right parties around the world, even in the United States. So I wanted to ask you about what's the role of Hungary in all this.
Thank you very much for having me. I will also obviously continue in English. Yeah, the different visions of the far right have definitely been one factor that has been hampering these parties' cooperation across Europe for a very long time. And in fact, these were not just different visions, but very often animosities against each other's nations. So if we were to look back to the early mid-2000s rather, there were examples when attempts of far-right parties' cooperation within the European Union broke down because one party was saying bad things about the other party's nation. Case in point was Romania and Italy. But this is not really the case anymore. And one of the reasons for this is that I think there has been a significant shift in who these parties identify as the enemy. And Carmen was talking about the central role of fear in far-right politics. This is precisely connected to enemy making. Whereas before, the enemy was the other or maybe even the neighboring nation in Europe, now the enemy picture is much more widely shared across the far right in Europe, and I think this has become much, much more unified over the past 10 years when 10 years ago the entirety of the European Union experienced the refugee and migration crisis. This united understanding of who the enemy, who the other is, has massively contributed to the growing international cooperation of the far right, and also fueling the fears in the population. They have also managed to strengthen their positions across the European Union. Of course, the polycrisis, other crisis factors have also contributed. Social media, digital technology altogether play a role. But we see a far right that is much more unified. Now, this does not mean that they agree on everything, and especially when it comes to their foreign policies and foreign policy goals and priorities. What they typically agree on is really what is informed by the very core of their ideology, by nationalism and sovereigntism. So they agree on migration being bad. They agree on the European Union being harmful for their nations. They call for more sovereignty for the nation state, and they speak out against supranational sovereignty. These are the points where they typically agree on, but they are really diverse when it comes to, for example, Russia, the United States, the neighborhood of Europe, how to deal with trade. There are really a variety of views. And these are informed by what any factor or any party's foreign policy would be informed by: the geopolitical space the country occupies, the historical experiences, threat perceptions, and so on and so forth, economic situation of the given country. So we do see diversity, but I do not think that this, at this point, is a factor that would undercut the international cooperation of far-right forces, because they do share a certain vision. And that is something that they have started to jointly work towards. Within the European Union, I think there is more and more convergence around the idea, especially among the established far-right parties, not the independent individual candidates who are still campaigning on very extreme ideas, but the ones that have become established parts of the political systems across Europe, Rassemblement National, AfD increasingly, in Central and Eastern Europe, Law and Justice, Fidesz, Fratelli d'Italia in Italy. These parties, especially since Brexit, do not really campaign for leaving the European Union. They are arguing for changing the EU from within. Now, I think what we need to underline here is that change within the EU is pretty normal, but the type of change that these parties are talking about is not reform. It's not a reform of the EU, but a transformation of the EU. The idea is that they want to change the very logic, the very function of the European Union. They want a purely intergovernmental cooperation. They want to do away with shared competencies. They want to delegate sovereignty back to the nation states. And here again, I'm saying nation states, because the way these parties understand their countries is the ideal that the nation should inhibit the given state and no one else. So what does this transformation really need? I absolutely agree with Carme that the main platform for these parties to exert influence is the Council. But I think the European Parliament actually does have a very important socializing role. We have seen now far-right cooperation lasting entire political cycles within the European Parliament, and these are opportunities for these parties to strengthen their networks and international connections, develop shared narratives, gain organizational experience, gain political experience, access funding. These all contribute to their strengthening and cooperation across the European Union. If you think about it, there are parties and there are organizations connected to these parties, which are applying for funding from the European Commission, pursuing agendas that would actually want to do away with the European Commission. So the EU and the European Parliament as such is also a tool for these parties to cooperate, even if ultimately they do disagree on a lot of things when it comes to how they see their or their country's position in the world. And coming to Hungary, in closing, in a few points maybe. Hungary, and I need to differentiate here, I'm Hungarian as well, and I do not consider myself part of that. So the governing party, Fidesz, which has been in power in Hungary for 15 years, coming up to 16 next spring, has become a central actor in organizing this international network of far-right parties and the far-right ecosystem, including think tanks, civil society organizations. It is a very wide and increasingly established network that spreads Europe, especially since Fidesz has left the center-right European People's Party and has been trying to establish its new political home in Europe. It has been cooperating with parties like Rassemblement National, most recently also with AfD in Germany, and here in Spain with Vox. Fidesz has been not only organizing networks, but there has been also campaign and political support for like-minded allies across Europe. In the case of Spain, a bank close to Fidesz circles have provided a loan for Vox. Now it has been documented 2 times. Also, it has provided a loan to Rassemblement National for Le Pen's campaign. Why is that? Why can Fidesz and the Hungarian governing party as such do this? Precisely because it has been in power for 15 years and it has virtually unlimited access to financial resources to pour into this, and it wants to stay in power and wants to shape the European system in a direction that it would foster its own interests, which is not a European Union that has any sort of oversight over democratic rules and principles in member states, but one that just works on an intergovernmental basis. Just to illustrate the spread of the network with 2 short examples. For one, besides the party political ties, there are, of course, think tanks, organizations that are active in networking, which I have mentioned. One such organization in Hungary that does have also an outlet here in Spain is the Center of Fundamental Rights, which has also been very active in developing shared narratives and understandings around the agenda of the far right. And also these networks now spread across the Atlantic. And there is increasing cooperation with Trump and with MAGA in the United States, which bring together far-right forces from both sides of the Atlantic, developing, again, shared narratives. Foreign policy goals and perspectives differ. They cannot be the same across the two sides of the Atlantic, but there are uniting narratives, and these are pretty much rooted in the nativist, sovereigntist, and exclusivist, exclusionary views of the far right that are present both in Europe and the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Zsuzsanna. Abusaré el meu rol de moderator.
I will abuse my role as moderator to ask the first 3 questions, and in the meantime, you can start thinking about the questions you want to ask the speakers. I will ask you to please ask questions and not make long comments as much as you can. Camil, I wanted to ask you about what you said about the identity crisis in center-right parties, because just as happened for many socialists, they were catch-all parties. Everything could fit in there. But we have thought long and hard about the trajectory social democratic parties should have, but we have not reflected so much about the paths these center-right parties could choose. I don't know if this is your area of expertise exactly, but that's a question I'm asking you. Carme, I wanted to ask you about whether Euroscepticism will change sides. I mean, far-right parties no longer defend exiting the EU, leaving the EU, but inasmuch as power, as these parties win executive power, there will be more power in the council. So may we start seeing left-wing parties asking to leave the EU?
To ask you, you mentioned Brexit and how this was a turning point for several far-right parties, but I would want to ask you about the Russian factor, no? Whether the Russian invasion of Ukraine changed some things regarding the relationship between far-right parties and Russia, and whether this changed views or not, whether Trump is now more important than Russia in inspiring this international list of the far-right. Anyone wants to start? Camil, vols començar tu? Do you want to?
Anyone wants to start?
You want to start, Zsuzsanna?
As you like.
Okay.
I can.
Go on.
Okay. Yeah, so the Russia factor. Obviously, this is the issue which is maybe the most obvious, where the far right across Europe is divided. And if we just take a step back and think of these parties' Euroscepticism, which is also rooted in their desire to do away with any sort of supranational institution that takes away their autonomy and sovereignty, then looking for cultivating relations with alternative power centers logically would make sense, and which center was close and was actually very much interested in these parties gaining power and weakening the European Union? Russia. So the pro-Russian ties in the far right in Europe, where they are present, are also interconnected with that. It's not only purely a love for the Ruski Mir. Now, I believe that even in Western European parties, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, this has shifted to a certain degree. And that close connection that may have been present has in certain cases, been toned down. It's not absent, it's not gone, but it is becoming politically costly in Europe. And I think this is a factor that we will need to also watch in the future. I think obviously the Hungarian governing party is a big exception here, which has not at all altered its course and its relations with Russia. In fact, we do see that under the influence of governmental, I would use the word propaganda here, there has been shifts in public opinion and public perception about Russia, about how people view Ukraine, which was particularly not much on the agenda before, and how they regard our alliances. I think this clinging on to the Russian line has multiple factors. The Hungarian government, for whatever reason, which is not entirely transparent and clear, refuses to do away with the Russian energy dependence of the country. In fact, it is continuing to increase that by the construction of a new nuclear power plant that would buy fuel from Russia and is built from a Russian loan. This is an outlier, and probably there are factors in play which we don't quite understand. But in the eastern part of Europe, I think the anti-Russianness of the far right has also gained some wind. If you look at Poland, Law and Justice, the Baltic countries, this is more of an existential issue for the given societies. And this is why it is a breaking line between pro-Russian and anti-Russian forces. Now on Trump, theoretically, the assumption could be that since there is so much ideological similarity between MAGA and the European far right, that the European far right should be all happy about Trump's re-election. And to some extent that's true, but at the same time, the policies that President Trump implements, particularly in the field of international trade, are actually clashing with the cultural war that he also wages and where he is in alignment with the far right. These tariffs, the trade policy of Trump is going to hit exactly the voter base of far-right parties. It is going to hit working class. It is going to hit the economies of the European Union. And it is quite hard for a far-right party to embrace an external actor that is harming the economy of its country. So Trump is important, and the whole far-right ecosystem in the US is very keen on developing ties with European far-right actors, parties, organizations, but it's not a clear-cut case of a new power center that can draw in all the EU's far-right parties to contest the European Union.
Yeah, you asked me whether Euroscepticism will change sides. I think Euroscepticism already exists in the left. This was your question. Well, I was thinking, for example, Mélenchon's in submissive France. I'm thinking of center-left, not so far left. Well, actually, when you ask the question, I was misinterpreting your question, but what I interpreted with the question at first was whether Euroscepticism would change sides. And well, for a few months now, I've been thinking about whether what may happen in the immediate future is that the distance between the electorate and the EU institutions will grow, between those who would like a more integrated and more political EU. This traditional conception of the EU. It's not Euroscepticism, because what they may want is a more integrated Europe. But what we see is that the distance may grow. There may be a broader gap with those who believe in the foundational values of the EU, which is mutating. The DNA of the EU is mutating as a response to the recent crisis. And if the electoral strengthening is this EU, I think it can alienate traditional EU voters, because what has been done away with is the former consensus. The social democracy crisis leaves us without this big coalition. And you know, I was critical of the big coalition, but there was a central consensus that had been built by the EU, and at the moment it is non-existent in the European Commission, and it is not existent in the Council. If they had told us 10 years ago that out of 27 members, only 4 members would be Social Democrats in the Commission and the others were on the right side of the spectrum, we wouldn't have believed that. So the traditional balances have been broken. And when I see this growing distance, I see it in those who are probably in favor of this traditional Europe that, well, we should accept that the nature of the animal is changing, but maybe it is taking us to a place where some of us may feel less represented than before.
Your comment, there was not so much of a question concerning the center-right, what you've just said. I'm not a specialist on center-right, but I do work in a project that that is based on an obvious observation. Namely, there's been in academia an explosion of studies on the extreme right, right? But you should ask a fundamental question: what is extreme here, right? This is the second, and this is linked to an observation, namely that what conventionally in political science has been taken for granted, the distinction between center-right and far-right, doesn't work anymore. It's a very fluid reality, and sometimes, to take the Spanish example, actually what you categorize as the far-right discourse, you're mentioning categorizing ecology as a new religion, dictatorship. Aznar was calling ecology the new communism, the new enemy after Islam, the new enemy of what? Of freedom, right? Actually, if you look at the rhetoric of Aznar, a center-right, conventionally, some 20 plus years ago, it resembles very much what we see in Ayuso, in Vox, and so on and so forth. These cases can be multiplied, and they're related to the transversal crisis, again, to very different degrees. The Republican Party is a zombie, turning into a very different party. Also, Modi's, the center-right, traditional center-right parties, is by all standards hyper-nationalist, exclusionary, religious parties. Extreme right. So this phenomenon is transversal. So our categories don't work anymore. What is going on to an important extent at the level of the center-right? You mentioned to connect with the question of inequality and lack of representation that you are mentioning, 2 different questions, and with the question of immigration and fear that both of you raised. It seems to me that the question of lack of representation, of inequality, are fundamental to understand the crisis of the current democracy, and also to criticize the inadequate answers of the political representatives, that is, of elites. Or one of the common strategies of the center-right elites is what it can be called displacement. That is, instead of dealing with the roots of the problem that threaten existentially our democracies, that lead to the threat, the existential threat of our democracies, what they do is to displace, to construct an enemy, right? And the enemy is, well, the immigrant. That's fairly transversal, right? So there is a sort of a normalization that is going on, and this is very worrisome because it happens. It doesn't come simply from outside. It's not that the extreme, some forces that are outside forces, they come contaminate us. No, it really happens at the core of our democracy is displacement. And this displacement has consequences, most likely, because if you don't solve the problem and you displace them, they'll get worse, right? And this is, unfortunately, what I think that plausibly will happen. You know, so bad news maybe. I want to just to introduce a piece of good news. There is fragmentation. You mentioned already the fragmentation between MAGA, you know, because they're very different needs, but also in the European Parliament there is fragmentation. Luckily, these extreme right forces are not really all the time reconciled. So actually you have three groups and plus the non-affiliated. So it's a very complex dynamic, and they have their conflicts, their egos. So there is politics, and that weakens them, luckily, both at the national level and also the European Parliament. Not to depress our audience, you know, to kind of come up with some maybe positive elements as well.
Thank you. Gracias, Camil.
Thank you, Camil. I will open it up to the floor in case anyone would like to ask any questions. 1, 2 questions. I will gather them in threes if there are enough questions. Camil, can I ask the question in Catalan? Yes. I have 2 questions. The first one is whether you could elaborate a bit more on the concept that you mentioned before about militant democracy. What countries tend to follow this model more? Younger democracies that are more insecure? And is there any sort of political cultural background that leads them to adopting this model? And the second one, well, at different points, you mentioned the common threads that connect all of these far rights, US, India, Europe. And the scapegoat that you mention are immigrants. But I think maybe we could fine-tune a bit more and say that the enemy is the Muslims. So I would like to know, maybe take a step back and see how liberal democracies have contributed to the creation of this scapegoat with the adoption of the narrative, the rhetoric, and the measures of the Great War on Terror that started after 9/11. Hold on. Give me a second, because I will collect a couple more questions. He wanted to ask a question as well.
I like a lot all the diagnostic that the different specialists present, but there is a way to revert that tendency for instance, in the different surveys that the right wing is growing. There is a way, and more when you see that in young generation, mainly male generations, many specialists mention that as a consequence of social networks influence, right wing is growing and continue growing, and is what we are seeing. In that sense, there is some suggestion to try to revert that, not because I am from left, it's just because I like the way to try to avoid that speech of hell that we are listening in every place, or we are totally condemned to that way. That's my question.
Any further questions at the back? It is a general question for all of you. Anyone can answer. And it would be The far right, not only in terms of their impact on the EU, but at a more global level, what impact could the far right have in terms of peace treaties or conventions that stem from the Second World War? Thank you. Camil, we'll start with you and then we will do a round like we did in the first panel. It is not only about Muslims, feminists, the other is more complex. It also depends on the context. In Europe, it's not just Western Europe, it's Eastern Europe as well. And for example, now, in Romania, for example, just to give you an example, Muslims are not a problem. We do not have this sort of immigration. Actually, traditional Muslims connected to Romanian history, the Ottoman Empire, are very well integrated. So the enemy now is the Nepalese, for example. The Nepalese are the enemy, but also feminists, neo-communists. It depends on the different country. The context is important. But otherness is made up of many complex factors. As to the militant democracy, there are different traditions, and the context matters. For example, there is a law in that direction as a response to the catastrophe of the two world wars in Germany. That's one context. There is another context. Both in Romania and Moldova, new laws are being developed to deal with a situation of extraordinary imbalance, inequality. They're neighbors of Russia. They have extraordinary economic resources. And in this information war, they systematically use social media. And this connects with the third question. There is a revolution, a clear revolution of the public sphere, the way in which we communicate. Carme alluded to this, which has a negative impact on democratic practices. This is obvious, and we need new laws. For example, what to do in an electoral process with the extraordinary multiplication of bots that speak in favor of a far-right party. They're very cheap. So, for example, in the Romanian elections, this was a big issue. And this will be a bigger and bigger problem connected to AI. We need new laws, and we need mechanisms maybe to ban, to exclude certain information dynamics. It is not an easy topic to deal with, but we have to do it. And as to the fourth question, I have no idea. But we have experts here who can answer. I also wanted to talk about social media, actually, which is what I do here, what I work on.
And I know that he's trying to be optimistic, but I think that yes, that we are condemned to that.
To me, this is one of the greatest challenges of the new political cycle in Europe. You said that we need laws, and for me, one of the areas where I see most changes in the political agenda is in how we have lost interest in regulation. The speech of J.D. Vance in Munich saying Europe has a problem of democracy, and he's not referring to the far right, he's referring to the regulations that establish limits to big corporations. For me, this speaks about where we are in democracy, and it is true that this new political cycle with the new majorities in the Commission clearly, but also in the Council of Ministers, the pressure to step on the brakes of regulation. That was a banner of EU, for example, with the regulation of the big technological platforms is real. I've been in meetings of the European Commission where the civil servants say, no worries, there will be no new legislations in the coming 4 years, when the application of the law on AI still has to be developed and the transposition of the digital services law is still pending. There's already not a lot of will in some European countries to apply this digital services law, which is the one that limits propaganda, the use of bots, political advertising in electoral periods. And this is where, earlier I said the EU is immersed in a change of nature, in a change of DNA. And there's debate precisely on the weight of regulation, the weight of the law, the regulatory model as the European way. This is one of the debates at stake. Another debate that comes from the other side of the Atlantic is precisely the concept of what is and what isn't freedom of expression. In the EU had an approach on freedom of expression, freedom of speech, which was a lot more along the lines of laws like Germany's, which sets clear boundaries to freedom of expression, for example, hate speech. But this concept of the First Amendment, well, nothing can affect freedom of expression, and the far-right forces are importing this into Europe in a way that didn't exist here, because we understood that there were limits, there were boundaries precisely to guarantee freedom of expression, and these will affect European debates as well. And thirdly, why is it so essential? And Camil mentioned it as well. Why is regulation so essential? Because the EU has evolved in all of this informational chaos we're immersed in the EU. When we talk about disinformation, we no longer stress the content, the lies. The stress is on the algorithm. The problem is not the lies. The problem is the penetration capacity and dissemination capacity of these lies. And this is precisely where the need to set boundaries and conditions to big technological platforms comes in. Yes, it's very difficult to moderate because it means I have to let others speak. But if I can say something briefly to what you said about regulation, about laws, I think it's very important, and I think we have not paid enough attention to it yet. Ever since the new commission was voted and von der Leyen won for the second time, there's been a lot of emphasis on defending European competitiveness, as if being more competitive was at the expense of regulating, when it is not necessarily incompatible. It is true that regulation comes at certain costs, but it also comes with a lot of benefits. And the narrative we've been building since then is precisely this. These are two contradictory and opposing things. And the narrative that I think we should strengthen, because I think this is what has made the EU in some ways a political dwarf, but in others a giant, is precisely regulation. And I'll stop there. Can I say something? Yes, of course. For me, the AI law is the clearest example of where the EU is at in the world. Since the EU does not develop AI, creates a law that regulates use, because you cannot regulate the programming because you do not have the technology. So you regulate the use of it. But this doesn't mean that as EU you cannot regulate use and at the same time incentivize production or development of AI technologies.
And maybe I would try to continue from here, meaning the role and line of regulations, which are trying to create new sets of rules of the game for all players within the European Union, setting new standards that citizens, companies, political actors should abide to. So I think this is going to become more and more the field of contestation in the European Union for the far right. They will be using their positions in the Council, in the European Parliament to shape and shift the European regulations. But also when talking about the rules of the game, I would like to link to the last question about the global impact. It's not only the regulations, rules of the game within the European Union that are and will be impacted, maybe not only by European actors looking at the Vance speech in Munich and the pressures from the big tech companies in the United States, but also the international rules of the game, the norms of the global order that we have been living in for several decades, or even if we look further back, since the Second World War. The United States, under Trump, is reviewing its commitments and memberships in international organizations. One of the first measures of Trump was to leave the Paris Agreement. Now, you could say that contesting climate goals is not a very specifically far-right topic. It is a topic that can be very easily instrumentalized by far-right actors, but it's not necessarily the content that I would highlight here that matters, although I am very sympathetic to the climate goals, but just the decision that international agreements that set constraints on what you want to do will no longer apply if you say so. And that is where the far right is, when in power, when in executive power, will, I believe, inevitably start to challenge the global order, purely because it does not want constraints on its own sovereignty. So far-right actors in power will, if circumstances allow, and they may not always allow, but when circumstances allow, will seek to deal with others bilaterally, will seek to pursue their own interest without any fixed constraints that could limit their autonomy and sovereignty. That is what we see now to the extreme with Donald Trump. Also think of his speech at the UN, in which he was challenging the organization, but also my own country. Hungary has been a member of the International Criminal Court, but since its interests no longer align, it wants to maintain its partnerships with Russia and Israel under Putin and Netanyahu. It just declared that, okay, we are no longer playing along with this. We are not going to implement international arrest warrants. This is an example where far-right actors decide that the commonly mutually established rules of the game should not apply. So that's where I think we do see their impact also on the world order, on the global order, and then we will see how it goes with trade, with international networks, and so on and so forth. One small remark on the inevitability of the trend and whether it can be reverted. I do believe it will have to be, because if not, then we are looking at a world that will become increasingly conflictual and confrontative, I believe. But while on the path, I think we also need to think of ways to prevent the further rise. And in that, I think, circling back to the center-right, mainstream center parties do have a very important role. We do see that the so-called cordon sanitaire is eroding in Europe. And I believe this is a huge problem. I think mainstream parties, of course, they are reacting to the electoral competition. They want to re-engage the voters who are shifting to the far right. But I believe by adopting the far-right rhetoric and positions, they are not achieving that goal, yet that is what they are doing. Instead of adopting those policies and rhetoric, they should be addressing the problems these voters face at the root and not address the surface, which the far right does. So I think we cannot underestimate to what extent the mainstream steps up against the far right.
Tenim temps per una ronda més? Sí, les preguntes.
We have time for one more round if the questions are short. Let us start over there.
Merci.
Thank you so much. The question is, who are the voters then of all of these far-right parties? Especially with all of these evolution since the beginnings. I remember a few years ago when Lionel Jospin got awful results, disastrous results, but the father of Marine Le Pen won the second round, or accessed the second round, and we look at them in horror, at least from our position. But we saw it as an isolated factor, and now we are seeing spots everywhere, which leads to depression. Camil, I think we are a bit depressed here that all of this is happening, but what I'm interested in is seeing what is happening with voters. Why are voters deciding to vote for these sort of parties? And I know, as you said, Carme, we have the social media, the disenchantment, we're not resolving problems, but what is the profile of voters for you? Thank you. Thank you. My question would be, the way I see it, out of the far-right parties in power, there are two models. I'm simplifying things. I know it's more complex, but what model do you think we will evolve towards? One would be, in Europe, some parties, such as Giorgia Meloni's, or the case of Austria, in which they use far-right positions to win more votes and to obtain power, but then at the end of the day, what they do when in power is different. They are caricaturesque in their actions, but then when it comes to the reality of things and their relations with Europe and in other areas, they govern, they rule in a more moderate way, we could say. Or maybe if Marine Le Pen wins, it could be the same case, although she's not at the same level as Giorgia Meloni, the way I see it. But the other model would be creating executive actions along the lines of the far-right program, which would be, for example, the case of Hungary with Fidesz, with attacks on the freedom of the press, attacks against the justice system, LGBTI freedoms, and also the case of America, the case of Donald Trump, which, well, the way I see it, is a more direct and executive action. Which of the two models do you think will impose itself in this environment? Thank you. There was one final question? Yes. Yes, go ahead. Could you say what is the role of the left wing in the rise of the right wing? What is the role of the left or the complicity of the left? Very briefly, because it's not your first question, is it? You already asked. You're committed. Okay. So earlier we were talking about the importance of social media for far-right parties. Could we say that in connection with globalization, a more globalized world favors them because many more people can listen to their ideas and therefore they can impose themselves in the world? Or is it contrary to them because their ideologies are about having a more traditional structure, these classical values of the nuclear family, for example? So what is more favorable to them? And secondly, maybe I would like to reformulate my first question from before, but you can decide not to answer if you want. What is the perspective, or what effect may far-right parties have on international justice? Thank you.
You go first. We have 7 minutes in total, so not each.
In that case, I would maybe pick up on the models because I feel personally compelled to engage with the question because of the Hungarian experience. I don't think that we are on a path to see one or the other model rising. Much rather, I would look at it in the specific contexts in which far-right parties manage to get access to power and what those contexts allow. So if you look at the Hungarian example, which is really an extreme case, the fact that Fidesz and Viktor Orbán could really go that far is because and implement a program that is outright a far-right program is because the party gained a constitutional majority, for one, and through that it could reshape the very system it operated in. But even then, initially, the progression, I would say, was hindered by the fact that Hungary is a member of the European Union, and the Hungarian government at that time still expected to draw benefits from Hungary's EU membership money. And as the confrontation grew, it became clearer and clearer that there's going to be more and more pressure on Hungary. Relations broke down, and now the governing party just goes ahead disregarding the European regulations in many cases because it doesn't expect much of anything anymore. So the constraint, in a way, is eroded. And what we see in the case of Meloni, that sort of moderation compared to what we would have expected, is due to constraining factors. It's due to the fact that she is in a coalition government. She needs to moderate her positions to keep her coalition together. She's also reliant in a way on the European Union to deal with the migration crisis that her country is facing. She also expects that by moderating, she will be able to maintain power longer. But if you look closely, she's also trying to erode democratic norms within. And then the case of the United States, no constraints whatsoever. So, of course, that is why we see that the progression of the agenda is so fast, so widespread. Everything is happening all at once, and the erosion is much quicker than we would have seen in any of the European countries where you need to deal with other parties, where you do have the European Union. That's not there in the United States. So it's context dependent, in short.
Perfil dels votants, justícia internacional.
Profile of voters, international justice, role of the left. You can take your pick. I think he asks for something very specific, and I don't know the reason behind his question, but I think Zsuzsanna, in a way, already answered that, because it's international justice, but also international governance, what they are challenging. We see this with Trump, not just the Paris Agreement or the treaties Fidesz, and not just Fidesz anymore, but other parties in other countries in the EU, for example, also want to leave the Istanbul Convention on gender violence, or European countries that did not support the Global Compact on Immigration and Asylum of the UN. So I think it's connected. It's this feeling of accepting a governance above you. And in terms of international, well, not international legislation, but another of the trends that we are seeing an increase of is the confrontation between politics and courts. We're seeing this with migrations clearly in the US, but the same thing happened in Italy to Meloni with the intention of opening centers in Albania. There is a confrontation between justice and the politics of these governments. And who are the far-right voters? Earlier we said that far-right is diverse. I think their voters are diverse as well, and they respond to very different motives. I think they respond first to, well, we talked about globalization. They respond to an unprecedented increase in inequality ever since the financial crisis, which has not had a response. They respond to grievances, and grievances are different depending on the situation of each country, and they respond to fear. And I insist that what made these forces great is precisely this feeling that they are enemies, that we're vulnerable, a vulnerability that goes at such a swift pace that you do not have time to digest one challenge. You have the next one coming upon you. And this is why I'm also critical of this European discourse of the Europe at war, fear, the permanent threat, because to me it is a narrative that clearly feeds all of this. And as to the role of the left in the rise of the right, I think the left has not been able to manage these fears either. There has been no response, or there has been no convincing response to the voters, who then have gone for other recipes. And for me, it is clearly one of the big problems of social democracy, that it has defended a status quo that no longer works. So who will reform this status quo? Well, the right and far right are reforming it. They are the ones doing it, and this is one of the issues that we're facing. International justice.
To use the word of a theorist of law from the interwar period, Carl Schmitt, we are moving towards what he called the pluriverse, right? So we have different empires competing, generating points of disorder. Unavoidably, global justice and international justice, you gave different examples, is becoming weaker and weaker. Concerning the causes, inequality, actually inequality in Europe after the fall of communism has been constantly rising. It's not only after the financial, where in the circumstances of the, with some small exception, for instance, in Poland. But it's not only material inequality. You know, there are also other problems. For instance, here there are anxieties related to immigration and being displaced that are instrumentalized, right? Or in certain countries, for instance, actually well-to-do people vote for the extreme right because they don't feel properly represented by the mainstream parties. So there are different mechanisms, but definitely inequality is one of the key issues that should be at the center of those who want to answer this existential crisis of democracy, I would think. Third, models. I would add another model. Fascist model. That is a sort of systematically violent authoritarianism. That's the worst scenario, right? That can happen, right? Obviously, there are differences between Orban and Meloni, and for the time being, we are within the limits of some sort of constitutional framework and the instrumentalization of formal democratic mechanisms, you know, elections and so on and so forth. But it can get worse. We don't know. I mean, we're really in a time of deep transformation, and it's very difficult to predict. Keep in mind that 9 years or 10 years ago, we're not speaking about the extreme right. We're not speaking about populism. What is 10 years before Brexit and Trump's first election? What's 10 years, historically speaking? Well, nothing. Who was able to predict Trump 2, right? You know, the pressures of Greenland, the politics of tariffs, his intents to use the military against American citizens. That was not on the agenda, or a genocide. Sponsoring a genocide in the eyes of everybody, a huge tragedy. So you know, history is definitely heated up, and it's very difficult to predict. So hopefully we won't get to a third model. We will stick to this to an oscillation between these two models. It's very difficult to predict.
And to finish on a positive note, nothing is written. The fact that we are now in this situation, as Camil said, doesn't mean that in 10 years things may not change. I mean, it depends on external factors, but part of things depend on us, on ourselves. So, this is the end of the session today. Thank you very much.
I un aplaudiment per vosaltres.
And a round of applause for you. Thank you.